Greetings and welcome to the Barbra Gentry-Pugh Show, where we have expressions from the heart, the gateway to health, hope, and healing. Welcome. My name is Barbra Gentry-Pugh, and I'm your host for today. And I have as my special guests Beth Weber and Linda Haywood. Over the past few weeks, we have been talking about PG3 ministry and how God has birthed this ministry into us, and how we're just excited of what God is doing in our lives. On last week, Linda told her story. And one of the important things about PG3 ministry is how God brought us together because of what we have shared together and what we are sharing as a part of the ministry. One of the responsibilities of the ministry is to educate, and that's partly of what I'm doing. The other part is sharing information, but also showing God's power at work in the lives of his people. Yes. Linda, on last week, you shared with us your story and how God had truly, truly blessed your life. And it's been over a decade, and you are still doing wonderful after struggling with the mental illness for years. So we give praises to God for his deliverance and his power and work in you. And she shared a message of hope and healing. And that's part of what PG3 ministry is all about. Today we have Beth Weber. I had an opportunity to hear Beth's story about 3 years ago. And it just gripped my heart as a mother of what she was going through. And so part of PG3 Ministries is telling the story of the power of God and how he can work in the lives of his people. Today, Beth is going to share her heart about the loss of a son. And even though it's a loss and not a loss in a sense, and yes, she's going to be sharing really what that means today. One thing I learned about Beth is that all this struggle that she's been through, God has given her a greater love for him and a compassion to help struggling families that are dealing with mental illness. So Beth, I'm excited to hear your story, and I'm excited for the audience to hear her story. And I'm sure you'll be moved as we were moved the first time we heard her story. Beth, would you like to share?
I sure would. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Barbara. Well, my story begins, actually my story of faith begins when I was in my early 30s. I had grown up with religious, in a religious upbringing, but it was not until I was 33 years old that I actually understood the whole message of the gospel and actually received the gift of salvation and asked Jesus to be my Lord and my Savior. And at that time, I was a young mother with 4 children. My oldest son was on the foothills approaching adolescence, which is an understandably frightening time for a first-time mother. I had heard horror stories, and I was determined that I was not going to be a statistic, but that we were going to be exempt from the hazards of adolescence. And my Jimmy at that time was a very quiet young man, but as he moved toward adolescence, he grew even more quiet. I thought he was just shy. And then he began high school, and with the beginning of high school began some experimentation with alcohol. Now, as I've shared in our previous shows, I worked at a treatment center for alcohol and drug abuse, and so I was very aware of the warning signs and also was equipped with the skills to handle those episodes. My husband and I handled them quickly. We laid down consequences for the use and took away privileges, and it didn't do any good. Each year of his high school years, we watched his use progress despite our very appropriate disciplinary measures. By senior year, there were changes in our son. Up until that time, he had been an excellent student. In fact, by the beginning of his senior year, he had been offered several scholarships for college, and he was on the honor roll nearly every semester of his high school years. But his grades began to change, and he began to lose interest in things with the family, even more so than normal adolescence would bring. And there were other changes. There was a lot of strife in our family. There was chaos. There was agitation. Home sweet home wasn't always sweet the way it was before. Our hearts were breaking, and nearly every single one of our family members was experiencing some effect from those changes in his life. I was very involved in Bible study groups. I had a tremendous support system, and I prayed for my son, for my whole family, but for my son in particular. I had prayer partners, and we prayed fervently for his release from any hazards to his life and any destructive behaviors. But nothing seemed to work. In fact, the more I prayed, it seemed the worse things got. Well, I'll never forget one night in 1994, he was getting ready for a winter dance at the high school. And things had been very tense between us. I walked on eggshells a lot of the times, not knowing what to say, because most of my words were misinterpreted by my son, and it didn't end up nice. It didn't end up to be a good exchange. But this particular night, my son was getting ready for the dance, and he looked over at me and he asked me if I would help him get ready for the dance. Well, I have to tell you that I was just beside myself with excitement. My heart was just filled with hope, and I thought to myself, Lord, you've answered every single one of my prayers. Here it is. It's over, finally. All these hard times, they're behind me. I remember reaching up to pin his boutonniere on the lapel of his tuxedo. And with that, my son slipped his arms around me and pulled me close. In one moment, with one hug, without words, he expressed the love that I had been longing to receive from my son. Well, I slipped my arms around his waist and drew near. It was literally a Kodak moment, and it is etched on my heart, and I'll never forget it. My heart was filled with hope as I waved goodbye as he left for the dance. And by morning, my heart was pounding with fear when I realized he hadn't come home. Well, we made phone calls, and we finally found him. And once again, we took away privileges in response to the fact that he had been drinking. And he left for work, and later he called home, and we decided that it would be good for him to walk home about 1.5 miles. And he was quite angry about that. And I waited until I heard the back door open. And I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard the back door close, and I thought, oh good, he's home. Well, the next morning, I awakened to find out that he wasn't in his bedroom. He had left. Again, the search began. I called all over the community looking for my son, only to find out that the community had actually opened up their homes to him and became a refuge for our son. They saw our attempts at tough love as no love for our son. Things were miscommunicated in some way, and we were thought to be people who banished our son and kicked him out of the house. It hurt us deeply. It hurt us very deeply. For about the next 4 years, our son came in and out of our lives, mostly out. And in 4 short years, our scholar-athlete son spiraled downward from a young man with 6 scholarships to college to a homeless man living under bridges and hopping boxcars across the country. We were devastated. We were absolutely devastated. Occasionally he would call and it would soothe my aching heart. But those calls were few and far between. And then one evening, around 11 o'clock at night, the phone rang. Well, my husband and I nearly jumped. And my husband grabbed for the phone at the side of his bed. And he was talking, and I said, "Jim, who is it? Who is it?" And he said, "Just a minute." I knew it was my son, Jimmy. He handed me the phone, and I said, "Jimmy, is that you, son?" It was. It felt so good to hear his voice. My heart was filled with hope, almost the same way it was that night in the foyer when I reached up and he put his arms around me. But in a few short minutes, the sweetness of my Jimmy's voice, the experience became a bitter one because he was incoherent. There wasn't any reality in his conversation. You know, it was so precious to hear the voice of my firstborn that I couldn't bear to hang up. I listened to his delusional conversation for about an hour. And finally I said to him, "Jimmy, I love you, son, but I have to go now. I love you, my son." And I hung up the phone. I didn't know that December 9th of 2000 would be the last time I heard my son's voice. I waited, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I waited. It was a long, long wait. But it was during that time that my son was missing that I grew to know God's Son, Jesus Christ, very personally. Well, several years passed, actually nearly 12 years passed, and the phone rang again. On March 29th, 2012, I received a phone call. The voice on the other end asked if I had a son named Jim. I was startled, and I said, "Yes, I do. Why do you ask?" "We've been trying to find you," she said. "He's been burned in a brush fire. He's in a coma on a respirator in our hospital." While I got all the details of the hospitalization, my husband was on the internet getting tickets for us to fly out to see him. In 23 hours, we were standing at the foot of the bed of our long-lost son. The only way I can describe that situation is that it was surreal. He hadn't changed at all. I would recognize my son anywhere. And yet we were separated by almost 15 years. I tried to grasp at the pieces, the missing pieces. I tried to put things together. It was surreal. I didn't know what to think. I knew that there was a possibility that my son would have a hard heart against us. And I knew that my days were limited if he still harbored any resentment or anger toward us. And he might just wake up and banish us from his bedside. And so I took every chance I could, and I touched him everywhere I could. I touched his feet, and I counted his toes, just like I did when he was a baby. And I squeezed his legs, and I touched his arms, and I kissed his face. And I gazed into his face the way I did so many years ago, when I never, ever dreamed that this would be an experience we would share. Well, he did wake up, and he did not banish us. It was surreal for him, too. Time had stood still for our son, I realized. While we were pining over the loss of our son and missing him desperately, I grew to understand that time had stood still for him. And because of his illness, he lived only in the present moment. And he really wasn't aching over missing us. And really, that was a blessing to know that he wasn't suffering and feeling ostracized from us. Well, during the hospitalization, I am pleased to report that his burns healed very well. And he came along beautifully, and we shared many days together over the 5 weeks we had there. But that was bittersweet, because we also saw, as he cleared from the medications and got better, we saw the signs and symptoms of the schizophrenia that we had long suspected. The diagnosis was confirmed by a psychiatrist and other professionals who assessed him. But even still, we got to know our son where he was at that time in the hospital. One day, I decided to take a field trip up to the area where he lived. It was actually quite wonderful. I was invited by the fire chief of that town to sit in his office. For over an hour, I sat and listened to him give me all the details of the fire, of the rescue, all the little morsels of information. I just hung on them. I got to meet the fireman who saved my son's life. I got to shake his hand and thank him personally. And from there, I went to the missions where my son frequents. I went to one mission, and the woman was so lovely. And I felt like I was at the high school conferences with his teacher. They gave me rave reviews about how much they loved my son. One woman looked me in the eye and said, "You know, you raised him right. You've got a good boy there." I was so proud of my son, and she told little tales, stories about his comings and goings. And then I went to the next mission, where my son has eaten lunch for the past 10 years. And I got to meet the people, the very people that God appointed personally to make tuna sandwiches for my son. The people that God handpicked to be the hands and feet of Jesus for my son. I was overwhelmed throughout the whole day. I learned all about his habits and where he goes and what he does. One very disturbing piece of information came along that day, though. I learned that the scene of the fire where my son was burned, the woods, has been my son's home for the last 10 years. When I spoke to one of the lovely men at the mission who got to know my son personally, he said, "Beth, sometimes I worry about him." One night it was forecast to be 40 below zero, and he sleeps outside without a tent. He just sleeps in a sleeping bag with a few blankets on the ground. I begged him to sleep here at the mission in my office, but he refused. That broke my heart to hear that. It broke my heart to hear that my son lives in the woods. I went back to the hospital, and I worked with the staff who was making plans for him to go home. And being a nurse and being involved in discharge plans, I quickly drew together a discharge plan of my own, complete with pictures of my son's home. And I laid out the photos of the burned woods and the charred tree stumps. And I asked the staff how they could possibly plan to send my son home, to his home. You see, he was being discharged with an open tracheotomy. It just broke my heart. As it turns out, the discharge was delayed, but the trach had not healed. My husband and I drove our son back to his hometown, and we went to the Army supply store and we bought a tarp. It was the least I could do to give me some comfort knowing my son was tucked in and there was a tarp between him and the ground. We were able, by God's grace, to get him into the homeless clinic, where a very dedicated and lovely nurse offered to do daily dressing changes. My heart broke when I looked at their supply shelves, which were nearly bare. She said, "Beth, I'd be happy to do those dressing changes, but I have to be honest with you. I don't even know if I have enough gauze pads for the next 2 weeks." It just broke my heart to see the deficits. It breaks God's heart too. But God moved mountains and opened doors, and my son was seen by the head of the clinic at the hospital, and the care of his trach was established, and the dressing changes were arranged, and by God's grace, he agreed to let us check him into a hotel across the street from the homeless clinic. So for 5 weeks, my son lived at the hotel, and he was able to walk across the street and go to the clinic and get the medical care that he needed. And I'm pleased to report that that trach did finally heal up on its own. But when that healed up, no matter how hard I tried, Jimmy was not interested in finding an apartment or any other kind of housing. He wanted to go back home, which meant he was going back to the woods. That was a very, very difficult thing for me to accept. But by God's grace, I stood in the parking lot and wrapped my arms around my very tall, lean young man, and I kissed him goodbye. And my husband and I drove away. A few months later, we drove back out, and I was able to share a birthday with my son for the first time in 18 years. I was so excited to see him again. I don't know why it didn't dawn on me that my son is homeless and that he would look homeless. The shock was a shock. His clothes were tattered and dirty, his hair unkempt, but he was glad to see me. And we spent a few days together. They were tense because he was not feeling well. And I was concerned. I was concerned about his safety. I was concerned about his well-being. And I tried to contact people to help me. But really, the way the system is set up, there was nothing I could do. And at the end of those 5 days, I once again kissed my son goodbye, and I watched him walk away back to his woods. And that's where we left him. You know, through this experience, I saw the homelessness. I saw the ravages of mental illness in the life of my son, my dear son, and it broke my heart. But the truth of the matter is, I feel blessed because I know that God actually gave me his heart for his own homeless, wandering children who have been ravaged by the effects of sin, who don't know how to come home, who don't know how to make their way back home to the Father. And I think because of this experience, God has birthed in me a passion for helping others to persevere. In fact, Hope Services is the ministry that my husband and I have started. And our ministry is designed to help others persevere and endure the trials of life. We've lived with years and years of uncertainty. And it's hard to live with uncertainty unless you know the source of everything that you need, no matter what happens. And so, even though I know that my son may never, ever come back, do you know I always have hope? Because God has promised that his son, Jesus Christ, will come back. And then the end of the story will come, and we really will live happily ever after, for all eternity, in the presence of God's Son, Jesus Christ. And so I hope that I have encouraged others. I feel like I've lived every mother's nightmare to an extent, and I want you to know that no matter what you're going through, you can always have hope too, because Jesus is coming back. God promised.
Thank you, Beth. What a powerful, powerful story.
Thank you, Barbara.
Every time I hear you, I see more and more of what God is just stretching you.
Yes.
And how he's just equipping you for the ministry that he has for you. I just have one question. It is so easy, even as Christians, it is so easy to slip into times of anger. Why, God? Why?
Yes.
And sometimes you hear people say, why not? But how did you miss those pitfalls of anger, guilt, shame? I've known you now for 3 years, and there's always a positive side. Mm-hmm. But I know there must be days that you have some very difficult days. But I know that God has sustained you. Tell our audience how you were not a victim of the circumstance and was able to rise above the difficulties.
Okay, I think what I want to say about that is I did go through all of that. I experienced shame. I experienced debilitating discouragement. I experienced humiliation through the conversations of others. I was accused of not loving my son. I was accused of being a mean and spiteful woman. I despaired. There were times when I really didn't want to wake up in the morning. I wanted to go to sleep and not have to face it again. And if it weren't for my responsibility to my other children, I would have even entertained taking my own life. I want to be perfectly honest with you. But it was in every single one of those experiences that I experienced the love, the mercy, the kindness, the goodness, the tenderness of God, because in all those situations, I literally poured out my heart to God. At one point, God asked me in my walk with him, because I went to the Lord initially, to be perfectly honest with you, I went to God constantly, but I went to God because I was going to ask him to bring my son back. But see, what happened is I kept going, and I was spending hours with the Lord, reading his word and experiencing his encouragement, and I got to know God more personally, more and more intimately. And at one point, God asked me, not with his voice, but impressed upon me, Beth, will you still love me if I choose never to bring your son back? I was shocked. I'll never forget that day. But you see, during that time when I was going to God, I got to know God personally. And I answered him through quivering lips. Yes, Lord, I will love you, even if you never bring my son back. Now, I knew that God might, but that commitment to trust God, no matter what he chose to do, was the turning point in my faith, Barbara.
Thank you, Beth.
Yeah.
You have helped not only Linda and I, just knowing you over the years, but you've helped many, many, many face the difficulties of life and yet get to know a God that can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or think, according to His glory.
His glory.
His glory.
Yes.
So it's really not about us.
No. No.
Even though sometimes God acts and we don't understand.
Right.
But we recognize that He is sovereign and He has the right to do whatever He chooses to do in our lives.
Yes.
And He just asks us to trust Him.
Yes.
And I am just so happy to know you and Linda, because you have put your faith in the sovereign God of the universe.
Yes.
And He says that I will use whatever I choose to use for me to get the glory.
Yes.
And that you can be an instrument of His love and peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's good to know you.
Thank you, Barbara.
God bless you. And so today,